So you want to be a dungeon master. You poor soul. Let's at least get you ready today on Bumbling Through Dungeons. So being a DM is one of my favorite things in the world right now, and it's probably my favorite role at the table in D&D. I like playing, I really like playing, but I love being a DM. And I think that's where a lot of my strengths and interests lie, because when you are really passionate about something, that comes through at the table. So let's get you started here today. If you're looking to be a dungeon master, what do you need to know? What do you need to have? What kind of things do you need to prep? What kind of clothes do you need to wear? That last one doesn't really matter. It probably doesn't matter. Just have clothes. So what are the reasons to be a DM? A lot of different reasons, and it might vary depending on your game group, but for many people, they are the dungeon master out of necessity. There's a group, they want to play Dungeons and Dragons, and somebody has to be the game master. Somebody has to run it. And if everybody wants to play, somebody has to kind of bite that bullet and be the one running the game. So this is actually fine because, one, you're getting to play, and two, in a situation like this, chances are, at least hopefully, you're able to set up a system where you sort of rotate, where one person acts as the DM and says, okay, I'm going to do this adventure arc, and then we're going to bump it over to you. So you might have some sort of rotation system. Even if you have a longer campaign going on, you might take some time off so that the person DMing has a chance to play. Then you have folks like me who apparently enjoy punishment, who always want to be the ones running the game. So if this is you, what are some of the reasons that you might want to get into dungeon mastering? Dungeoning master? No. So the first is that you enjoy storytelling, and you like being the one that sets the stage in which a story can take place. And you might have a flair for the dramatic. You might be able to do a lot of different voices. You might have a lot of ideas on different bits of lore and setting that you can pull in to create a really wonderful, interesting world in which the players can play in. That's a great reason to be a DM, and some of the best DMs are the ones that get really excited about those elements. Another great reason, and probably the biggest reason for me why I like it so much, is the immersion. So when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, chances are you're going to have some downtime. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot that you can be doing during your downtime. You can be taking notes, you can be listening to what else is going on at the table, you can be paying attention to what the DM's doing, what your other players are talking about, what their motivations are. You can be learning a lot when you're not actively doing something either in combat or in a social scene. However, inevitably, there will be moments where you have downtime as a player, where you're taken out of it, someone else, it has the spotlight for this scene, or maybe you've split up the party and the DM is off with the other side of the party and they'll get back to you, and you might have a 15-minute, 20-minute chunk before that scene ends and it comes back to you, and then you have the spotlight. Again, this is fine. This is part of play. This is part of the cadence of the game. However, as the Dungeon Master, there is much, much less of this. And so for me, at least, the immersion factor is much higher. When I run a session of D&D, I sort of dive in at the very beginning, and it feels like I don't come up for air until 3, 4, 5 hours later, however long the game runs for. It feels like I'm just immersed in this other world for that period of time, and it only ends when the session does. Now, this has an element of mental exhaustion, and even at times you can sort of feel it physically. There's a physical exhaustion because you're reacting to what the players are doing and setting the scene and running combat and having to portray the villains and the NPCs. There's so much that you need to be doing, but that can be really exciting because there's never a dull moment. There's never a moment where you're not immersed in this story, in this world. And so I really love that. By the end of a session, I am a little bit mentally exhausted, but it feels great. It's like when you finished a really hard task and you have a sense of completion afterwards. So even in an ongoing story arc, each session unto itself feels like a bit of an accomplishment when I'm a DM. But to paraphrase one of my favorite writers, the recently deceased Stan Lee, with that power, with great power, comes an element of responsibility as a dungeon master. So let's talk a little bit about that. What are some reasons that you shouldn't want to get into dungeon mastering? The first is actually related to one of the reasons that I think it's excellent too. It's that you're excited about telling a story. That can be a great reason to be a DM if you think you have a flair for it or there's a particular type of story that you want to tell. The danger here is that you want to tell your story at the expense of giving players meaningful choices. So this is what's known as railroading a lot of times, where you have your story and that story is going to happen regardless of what the players do or don't do, and they're just sort of along for the ride. This is the wrong reason to get into the game because it takes away player agency. Now, don't get me wrong, there will be things in your story that happen regardless of player choice. So these are elements of the world that are alive and moving, the parts that are moving, and these are the moments, the events that will create meaningful choices for the players. However, if you have an entire plot or story arc planned out and there's no way that the players can really deviate from it with the choices that they make, then you are on a railroad and you're taking away one of the most meaningful reasons to play D&D, and that's the ability to make those sort of choices that can affect the game world in unexpected and interesting ways. Another reason you probably shouldn't want to be a dungeon master is because you want the most powerful character with all the loot. This can create resentment at the table if you're doing this, and there's a thing known as the DMPC, or the Dungeon Master Player Character, that exists. And sometimes when you have these groups where everybody wants to play and nobody really wants to run the game, the DM might run the game for the players, but then also insert a character that they themselves play. This is what's known as the DMPC. I've heard stories of this working out really well, where it's fine, but the Dungeon Master has varying roles in the game, and also being a member of the party while running the game, and the villains and the story arcs and the plot hooks. Sometimes those two things can be at odds, and so it creates a little bit of an odd situation. And if you have a Dungeon Master who is trying to give all the best loot to their character, or who's trying to create just a broken, overpowered character relative to the rest of the party and sort of hogs the spotlight, that's not good. In that case, you should probably step back and look at the reasons why you're running the game. So if this is happening, it's probably worth having a discussion at your table about who wants to run and what type of game you want to run. However, from what I've seen in my own experience and also what I've read online, which is pretty extensive, these things seem to be relatively rare. They're the pitfalls to avoid, but for the most part, if you go in with the right mentality of, the player's fun is my fun, then you're going to be okay. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to accidentally railroad your players into something that you have planned. Those things happen, but as long as you're trying to improve and trying to create an experience for them that's very fun, their fun will end up being your fun. And I think that's an ideal situation. So that takes us through sort of the mentality of DMing, some reasons that you might want to get into it, some reasons that you might not want to get into it, and really a good way to approach the game. So now, what kind of things do you need to know? What kind of things do you need to purchase? How much do you need in order to be able to run the game? And much like the video we just did on playing, the answer is not much. You don't need a whole lot to start the game and run it and really have a good time. You're going to need a little bit more than what players are going to need, so there is a little bit of a startup cost, but I think it can be easy to get lost in the current culture of gaming where there's so many really good options, if I'm being honest, really amazing things that you can purchase to amplify your experience, whether that's different play mats or different miniatures, or there's battle terrain that you can purchase and different dice sets and adventures, and pretty soon you can go far down this rabbit hole and having spent hundreds and even thousands of dollars on this hobby. So that can be a little bit daunting to people, but the good news is you don't need all that. If you just want to run the game, have a good time with your friends, you really only need a few things, and then you will be set for really as long as you want. And then if you want to add in some of that other stuff later on, you can, but it's never going to be necessary. So the first thing that you're going to need is the player's handbook. I would recommend purchasing that, reading through it at least once, probably twice, if you haven't already. So you're going to need to have a really good understanding of the rules, and the more fluent you are with the rules and some of the fiddly rules that might come up during combat and different situations like that, the easier it's going to be to run the game when you're at the table. If you're having to stop frequently to look up rules, that's going to break the immersion, that's going to break the flow of the game, and things are going to take a lot longer, and it's going to feel like it's stalled a little bit. So the better you know the rules, the better you're going to be able to just play the game when you're at the table. Some people might say that you need the DM's guide, and I'm actually not one of those. Now, I think the DM's guide is good to have. I think if you're going to be running the game quite a bit, so if you're running a campaign, it's going to be worth your while to purchase the DM's guide and eventually read through it cover to cover. There are a lot of interesting, good things for Dungeon Masters in that book. But in a technical sense, to run the game, you don't need it. A good friend of mine is in the middle of her second full campaign that she's running. She might have purchased the DM's guide by this point, but I know for a fact that for a long time, at least well into her first campaign, she was running and everything was going great, and she didn't own and had never read the DM's guide. She had a good grasp of the rules, she understood how she wanted to run the game, and everyone at the table had a good time. So I didn't play in that first campaign, I am in her second campaign, and we're having a great time. So I think the moral is, it might be able to deepen your understanding of the game, but at the same time, if you're just looking to run the game, everything that you need is actually in the player's handbook. And if I'm being perfectly honest, the Dungeon Master's Guide only has a handful of things that I've really pulled into my own game in the DMing that I've done as well. So it's not been nearly as useful as the player's handbook. All right, sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled whatever. I know I changed shirts, but this is Mark from the future. So I put the video together and I forgot to include some stuff. So I'm here to correct that wrong before people tell me about it in the comments. Let's go. So I had it in my notes to talk about the monster manual, and then I completely forgot about it when I was originally recording this video. So this is a little addendum to right that wrong. So the holy trinity of books to prepare you for running the game and playing the game are the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. And I think if you're going to be serious about the game and be playing it and certainly running it with any regularity, you're going to eventually need all three. I hope I wasn't too flippant earlier in the video talking about the DM's guide. I don't think it's absolutely necessary to run the game, especially if you're newer and just trying it out. But I do think eventually it's good for all DMs to have. And that's doubly true, I think, of the Monster Manual. I'm at the point now where there's so many online resources that a lot of times I will just pull stats from monsters from online resources, and I don't go to the book itself. But there is a lot of great material in the Monster Manual about lore of the different monsters and creatures, and also how you can use them at the table and in the game world in ways that seem organic. So I would definitely recommend it. If you're only going to be running the game once to try it out, I wouldn't say that you need it there. You can probably cobble together some things from online sources and stat blocks and things of that nature, but I think it's an absolute necessity along with the Player's Handbook and eventually as well the DM's Guide for serious DMs. All right, sorry for the random edit, and back to your regularly scheduled video. Beyond that, the things that you're probably going to need are at least a few sets of dice, pens and pencils, and paper for note-taking for your players. You should also have some character sheets for your players. You can get all this stuff for free online, print them out, and have them available for players at the table so that if they forget things on a given week, you have those extra resources for them to use. I would also add a battle mat to that as well. You're probably going to need that at some point. Most groups aren't going to run combat as theater of the mind. You're actually going to need to visualize it out on the table. So having a battle mat and some markers with which to write on it, you're going to be able to draw any map that you need. And I'm just talking about sort of a generic square battle map that you can put figures on and run combat. I'll link to a couple down in the description. There are others available. You can also get more specialized battle maps that have certain terrains on them, things like that. But all of that can be handled at the table where you're just describing the scene. You don't necessarily need maps that have those elements on them. Again, that's a rabbit hole that you can go down if you want to spend a lot more, if you want to really customize your game. And I do have some of that in my game, but again, if I'm being honest, it's not stuff that I need to have. I would have been able to do everything that I've already done with DMing with just a single generic battle map. And then beyond that, in terms of physical resources, you'll find as you run the game that there are certain things that you might find yourself wanting, and those are going to inform your choices. Like, what would I have used in this combat if I had had it? And for me, like, one of the first things that I purchased was a number of flight stands, because I was running a lot of three-dimensional combats, and I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do as much of that as I wanted to if I didn't have flight stands to manage elevation on the battle map. So that was one of the first things that I bought that was really useful to me, but a lot of those are just ancillary. You can make do without them, and it might be different for you. You might want different styles of battle maps. You might want miniatures. You might want player aids that help manage things like initiative order. So there are a lot of things out there, and there's no one that I think is necessary, but it's good to know what is out there and start to look around to see what you might need at the table and what you might be able to get use out of. And the last thing I want to talk about is finding resources online that are going to help you become a better dungeon master. So the internet is a great place to be for D&D these days. Much more so than it was even 5, 10, 15 years ago, certainly way back in the early days of the 80s and 90s before, before the internet existed, and then before a lot of the resources existed on the internet like they do today. And there's too much out there for any one DM to absorb it all, and it'll end up pulling you in a lot of different directions. But I'm going to do a video later on talking about specific resources for DMing and for playing, but I think it's important to find a couple resources that work for you. A lot of great videos and a lot of great channels on YouTube can help you with that. I like to separate it into channels that talk about DMing and channels that show DMing. So these are your live plays. And a lot of those can take up a lot of your time, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend watching entire seasons or arcs of those, but finding a dungeon master that you enjoy watching that you can pick up some ideas from so you get a sense of what game flow is like. And then the second type of channel that I would try to find at least one of is a channel that talks about DMing. It doesn't necessarily show play at the table, but it's walking you through the steps and talking you through some of the philosophy and best practices that they've found. Hopefully for you, Bumbling Through Dungeons is one such channel that you can use as a resource. There are a bunch of others out there. Like I said, I'll talk more about that in a later video specifically on resources that you can use, but just to get you thinking about finding those types of resources. So once you know the rules pretty well and you think you got everything you need to run your first session, that's when it's time to find yourself a session to run. Either create it yourself or find one online. DM's Guild is a great place for that. And then find yourself a group and have a great time. There is a lot more that can be said about running the game, and that's the reason channels like this one exist, is because it is more art than science. There's a lot to discuss, and there's a lot of different variables at the table and a lot of different ways that you can run an interesting game. So there's a lot that you can talk about, but at its core, everything that I've talked about today, just having the right mentality going in, having a good understanding of the rules, having the few materials I think you need to run a session, that is really all you need to get up and started. And beyond that, the best way to learn is to just jump in, get to the table with a group of friends or even strangers who are interested in having the same type of experience as you in a fantasy D&D role-playing environment, and just throw yourself into it and be forgiving with yourself. You're going to screw up a lot of things, and you're going to mess up rules, you're going to forget things that you planned out in advance, and there's going to be things with game flow that you wish you could manage better. A lot of that's going to come as you play the game. But as long as you're, one, doing your best, and two, trying to learn from your experiences, you're going to continue to improve. And each time you sit down at the table, you're going to feel a little bit more confident, and chances are you're going to have a great time. So I hope this demystified running the game and some of the things that you need to start up with running the game. And if you have any other questions or advice that you think I missed, please put them down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you. We'll see you next time. So you want to be a dungeon master. You poor soul. Why does that happen every day? every day, like 4 times a day. Just like beep, 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 beep. It goes like 4 or 5 times and then it's done. I have no idea why. Somebody's car is just like, they just have it to go on random mode.